What government has to be very careful of, whether it's childcare policies or universal preschool or things like this, is at the end of the day, families should decide what they want. If they want to be a single income family and choose to arrange their care around that type of model, well, good for them. If they want to do it in a different way with both the husband and wife working, well, good for them. That's their choice. So I think what good policy does is enable choice and for families to be in control of those choices.
Hey, everybody, and welcome to the Paula Ferris Show. I'm your host, Paula. I am so fired up. I'm fired up for two reasons. Number one, we have a prime minister on the show today. Never had a prime minister on the show. Number two, I'm so fired up about this conversation that we are going to be having. So last week, kind of kicking off a series on the state of American families. How are we doing? How are we supported here in America? And we had Neha Rush, who is the founder of Mother Untitled, to talk about why so many women are leaving the workforce or are considering leaving the workforce. 1 in 3 are considering pausing their careers. 1 in 2 are considering downshifting because being a working mom, being a parent just doesn't work in this country. Okay, so I want to ask you a question and think on it for a second. What do you think is the number one barrier to women in the workforce? I'll ask it again. What do you think is the number one barrier to women in the workforce? What are your thoughts? Think about it. I feel like we need some music here. Okay, do you want to know what the answer is? The answer is this: the lack of access to affordable and quality childcare. Let me say that again. The number one barrier to women in the workforce here in the United States is the lack of access to affordable and quality childcare. And where we've gone wrong in this whole conversation, and this is what frankly pisses me off. Sorry, I told you I'm fired up today. What really irks me is that we've made this a political issue. It's not a political issue. Yes, it's a moral issue, but even more so, it's an economic issue. It is good for the economy to support families. And that's why our guest is joining us today. He is the former Prime Minister of Australia, Scott Morrison, and he is going to tell us what we can learn from Australia about how supporting families grows the economy. Okay, so I just want you to be real with me for a second, level with me. Do you think we're doing a good job supporting families in this country? We say we're pro-family, right? But when you think about it, are we? I'm actually going to do a poll on my Instagram. I'd love for you to weigh in. We'll also continue this conversation in my personal newsletter. Make sure you're signed up at paulaferrisofficial.com. And congrats to the winners from last week's newsletter, Marsha, Kathy, Pam, Sherry, Courtney, and Lisa, for winning a copy of Dr. Haver's book, The New Menopause. Okay, so back to that question. What do you think? Are we doing a good job supporting families in this country? Because here's the reality, and I'm just reading you the research and the stats, okay? This is not my personal opinion. This is statistics. We don't have subsidized childcare in this country. We don't have federally funded paid family leave, and we're the largest country to not offer that. We barely have tax credits for having children, and we don't have universal pre-K. Now, if we just added subsidized childcare alone, do you know how much we would increase our GDP? We would increase our GDP by 1.6 trillion with a T. 1.6 trillion. The realities also are we're having fewer and fewer kids because it's so freaking hard to have kids in this country. The stress and the strain and the lack of family-friendly policies and the attitudes here in this country. Your kid, your problem, right? We lose $122 billion every year due to the challenges in securing affordable and quality childcare. $122 billion each year in our economy. And again, it's the number one barrier to women in the workforce. So when we support families, when we support family-friendly policies, we're not just growing our economy, it's good for families, it strengthens families, and it really kind of levels the gender equity gap and the gender equality gap. And that's why I'm so excited for Scott Morrison to join the conversation so that we can kind of depoliticize this and he can come at it from an economic issue, why they supported family-friendly policies in Australia, what it did to the economy, how we can do so here, and what our next step should be. And also, there's this. Everybody wins when the family is strengthened. We know that financial stress and financial strain in a family can rip it apart. So fired up for this conversation. I think you got that by now. Oh, and one more thing, make sure you stick around to the end of the conversation to hear my key takeaways. And also the guy who reached out to me on LinkedIn who kind of started this whole conversation to begin with. So without further ado, here is the former Prime Minister of Australia, Scott Morrison, or ScoMo, as they call him down under. Well, Prime Minister Scott Morrison, I have to say, I am a tad bit nervous because I have interviewed presidents, senators, United Nations ambassadors. I have never interviewed a prime minister. And so this is... Well, there I go. So should I call you Prime Minister Morrison? Would you like me to call you Mr. Morrison? How would you like me to address you?
Whatever makes you comfortable. In Australia, they colloquially call me ScoMo around the place. It was a nickname that came my way during politics over a long time. But whatever makes you comfortable. I've always respected how in the United States, there's a great sort of valuing of office in the United States. I think that's one of the really positive parts of your culture.
So you're saying that they don't value the political highest office in Australia if they're calling you ScoMo, which is Scott Morrison.
When I was Prime Minister, they used to call Boris Johnson Bojo. So we were ScoMo and Bojo. We used to do quite a bit together. But that's just the Australian laconic, very casual way we do things here. We're a pretty egalitarian society, and if anyone rises above their station in Australia, they're pretty quick to drag you back.
I love it. You don't let anyone get too big for their britches, even if you're in the highest office, right?
That is true. Yeah, that is true.
Okay, so I don't know if you're on LinkedIn, but I'm on LinkedIn and I really do a lot of advocacy work for working moms and families. And Prime Minister, I had someone from a childcare provider in Australia reach out to me, and they said that our government needs to look at how you do it in Australia. This gentleman's name is Michael. I'm going to give him a little bit of credit. And so I had this idea as we're doing this series about American policies and are we really family friendly and what are we doing for families in our country, in the United States of America? I was like, how about if I talk to the former Prime Minister of Australia? You were in office from 2018 to 2022. And I know you were very instrumental in pushing forward childcare subsidies, which is the norm in Australia. But here in America, Prime Minister, I don't know how familiar you are with our family-friendly country, but we don't have subsidized childcare. We don't have paid family leave. We barely have child tax credits, and we don't have universal pre-K. We don't really sponsor after-school care. So I would love to discuss with you the economic impact, because I know that that's a huge factor. It actually increases the GDP when you have subsidized childcare. So first of all, kudos to you for supporting these policies in Australia.
Well, thank you. I should be clear, though. I mean, these are policies that have evolved and improved over time and continue to do so.
Yes.
I compare it to, say, our health system. I mean, our health system is a hybrid of the US system and the British system. So it's not all public, but it's not all private either. And there's private health care and there's public health care, and that occurs at both hospital and general practitioners. And so there is an appreciation of the need to have policies and supports that at the end of the day give people security and choice, which I think is what this is fundamentally all about. What government has to be very careful of when you support, whether it's childcare policies or universal preschool or things like this, is at the end of the day, families should decide what they want. If they want to be a single income family and choose to arrange their care around that type of model, well, good for them. If they want to do it in a different way with both the husband and wife working, well, good for them. That's their choice. So I think what good policy does is enable choice, and for families to be in control of those choices. Now, what I found, I was actually the childcare minister long before I was Prime Minister for a period, and we did some big reforms then. And what we were trying to do then, we called it the program Jobs for Families. And because it was about understanding that there were many families that just did not have a choice about whether one or two parents worked. That was an economic necessity. And I'd say that's even more the case today than it was back then.
Right.
That was around about 2014, 2015. And so we structured the childcare subsidies in a way that targeted the biggest support to those who are on middle incomes and lower incomes. We said these are the families that haven't got a choice at the moment. And so they need to be supported so they can stay and work, so they can pay their mortgage, so they can we can ease the pressure on them and that their families don't suffer. I have no doubt in many cases, some of those families may have preferred to have one parent working and one parent at home, but they didn't have that choice because of the economic necessity. So a lot of the policies I drove when I was the minister was about trying to target that support more effectively to those families who needed it the most. Now, that meant if you were on a higher income, even politicians' salaries, that meant you paid more for your childcare than those on lower and middle incomes. And so there was a progressive model to how we did it. Now, more recently, the new government has gone further than that, and they've expanded that support more broadly to the upper end of the scale. And that's fine. But it does come at a big cost. I think it's just important to get the balance right on these, and but importantly, help those who need it the most.
I'm just the outside looking in, and I'm a registered independent here in the United States. So I don't necessarily lean Democrat or Republican, but I do lean very pro-family policies. And I do know, and we're specifically talking about childcare right now because I didn't know you were the childcare minister. That's so cool. But childcare alone here in America, here's a statistic that may or may not surprise you. But in America, we lose $122 billion in our economy every year because of the lack of access to quality and affordable childcare. And if we would just subsidize it similar and comparable to other countries, we would increase our GDP by 1.6 trillion. I think where we've gone wrong, and I would love your take on this, is that we've politicized this issue and we haven't made it an economic issue. So I want you to tell us why subsidized childcare is an economic issue.
Well, that is exactly the reason why I did it when I was minister and followed that through as we further developed the program when I was treasurer and when I was ultimately Prime Minister. The reason is fundamentally economic. And what we saw happen as the childcare supports came in, and it has been pretty much bipartisan here in Australia. The partisan differences are more about the structure of the program and where it focuses and those types of issues. There's not a debate about whether it should exist or not. There's absolute unanimity, I should say, on that point. And we saw female workforce participation boom under these childcare policies. It enabled people to be in work, stay in work. And that was quite economically empowering to families. As we know, the biggest reason for family breakdown often is financial. In fact, often is predominantly financial. And when you're able to relieve that stress on the family, families will come under enormous stress, and that can lead to all sorts of social problems, and that leads into other social problems. We know the biggest route to poverty is family breakdown. That's what we've seen, devastate our society, your society, many others. When families break down, it is not just a social loss; it is an economic loss as well. So, times have changed, and you've got to recognise that families have got to take on economic options that they previously may not have preferred to do, but now they do. Now they have to. And so to enable that, the society does become stronger economically and socially. But I stress the point, you've always got to try and match the system. It was actually the Howard government, which was, John Howard was one of my mentors. He was two governments before ours, but he initiated a thing called the family tax benefit. And what that tried to do is provide greater support to one-parent working families, and that was about levelling up how effectively their income was taxed, and it just gave more support to families with kids, and particularly if there was only one parent working. Again,
right,
a good economic policy is good family policy. A family that has a job, a family that has financial security, um, is going to be more likely to be successful than one that isn't. It's not a guarantee of it. There are many other things you've got to address. And one of the things we did when I was Prime Minister in particular, but also Treasurer, is we massively increased the funding for programs that dealt with violence against women and children. And, there's a lot of education funding in that as well, because we know what can happen, where violence against women and children starts is disrespect of women in particular. And not all disrespect leads to violence, but I'd say pretty much, if not all of it, I'd say all of it starts with it.
Yeah, I applaud you for the work you're doing for women and families and children. And you said that the biggest breakdown is financial. You'll get some pushback every now and then that, oh, well, the woman needs to be home raising the children. But I very much advocate for parenting being a team sport. And it's best when both parents are involved. And most families need two incomes to exist, at least here in the United States. But if I were to ask you, what do you think, Prime Minister, is the number one barrier for women in the workforce here in America? Any guesses what it might be?
Well, I couldn't tell you what it would be in America, but in Australia, even with the supports we currently provide, the whole process of having children always tends to prove, as you know yourself personally, highly disruptive.
Very much so, yeah.
And that's a blessing and a joy. It's a welcome disruption, and it's wonderful. Even when they're teenagers, you remember those times. Mine are teenagers at the moment. They're wonderful girls. So
I have two right now.
About.
So oh my gosh, yes,
Still,
I don't know what
happened
to my sweet little angels. Whew.
Yeah.
Yes.
But the point is, it is highly disruptive, and it can be disruptive to education, continuing education. It can be disruptive to promotion opportunities. It can be, it is a big disruptor. And that is often less about the supports that are provided, childcare essentially, and so on. But that also gets to the flexibility within the firm as well. And yes, we have paid parental leave, and that's not gender specific, and we've had that for a while now.
Bravo.
Look, I can't say. I mean, it's enormously generous, but it exists, and it's not done at one's wage or things like that. If it's done at one's wage, that has to be supported by the company. For small businesses, one of the reasons, we do things like paid parental leave, is small businesses can't afford to provide the full, always paid parental leave support at salary. But at least it keeps them in the mix. If you've been working for a small, medium-sized business, probably in a place where you live, and there are a lot of those where you'd live, I'm sure, they're not Apple and Microsoft. They've had people who've worked for them for years, and they go off and have kids. That's a wonderful time for all of them. The business is as much part of the family as often, the other extended family members are. And those supports, I think, help very much those communities as well to sort of stay together, and their businesses work through what are happy disruptions, but they're disruptions nonetheless.
Yes. And I know when I became a mother, I became more empathetic and efficient and productive and courageous and a better visionary and a leader. And yet here in America, it's very much like, oh, she's not committed anymore to her job. She's counting Cheerios in the corner. She is, or do you have Cheerios in Australia? Or she's spreading Vegemite in the corner or whatever she's doing. But look at us like a risk and a liability. Yeah. What was that? I'm sorry.
We have Wheat Bix, but I know what you mean. I know what you mean.
Yes, but to answer that question that I asked you about what the number one barrier to women in the workforce here in America is, it is the lack of affordable and accessible quality childcare. That's the number one barrier to women in the workforce here. And we also are paid less. Mothers are paid less, according to the Pew Research Center in America, 70 cents on the dollar. So it only makes sense that we carry the brunt of that. 4 times more women left the workforce at the beginning of the pandemic than men. And so So there is definitely a gender equity issue there too. Let's talk a little bit more about the economic impact, because I think that's where we really have to dig in. We can't politicize this. We need to make it an economic issue. And to me, like, it just makes so much sense. You look at other countries like China and Singapore and in East Asia, where they're investing billions of dollars into their economies to reverse the trends of low birth rates, Prime Minister. Because they know that they can't grow their economy because they don't have, people weren't having children. And now here in America, we have record low birth rates. And it's not out of desire. We actually want children, but it's the stress and strain of raising children. So I really want to bring back this economic issue of like how imperative it is. Like, what would you tell our politicians? And they're crazy, let me just say, here in America, what would you tell our politicians about how important it is to really support families at the policy level? Not just because it is the right thing to do, but it is the economic proficient thing to do. It's going to be good for the economy. If you had a phone call right now with our two nominees, Donald Trump and Kamala Harris, what would you tell them? And why would you try to convince them to really support families through policies?
The number one reason for doing it, I think, ultimately, is the economics. I mean, if you really sit back at it coldly and just look at the functioning of your economy and the fact that, half of your workforce, if your economy is running well, should match what the population is, which a little bit over half of it will be female. If you're got a massive obstacle for those who want to participate in the workforce not being able, well, you've got one hand tied behind your back as an economy, and to enable the choice for people to enter the workforce and be in the workforce and stay in the workforce, sometimes out of necessity, but also out of choice. Then you are based. I mean, what's the biggest challenge that economies are facing in Western nations around the world today? It's workforce. It's skills. That is the key challenge.
Yes.
And when you're leaving more people who want to be in the workforce out of it through such an obstacle, well, you're really not allowing your economy to fire on all cylinders. And so that's why I called our childcare policy jobs for families. Families need jobs to sustain themselves, and the economy needs families to have jobs and to be in the economy.
Yes.
But I would always temper it with, design it the way you want, and to reflect, the priorities that you have around it, and also respect choice that families want to make and enable those choices as well. I think that sometimes get lost, and sometimes the hostility towards childcare policies is that the government's trying to tell us that we're not allowed to be one-parent families in terms of working. And look, if you want to be a one-parent working family, fine. If you want to be fine. But the economics shouldn't be determining that choice. That's the issue. In our family, we made that choice to be a one-parent working family. Others made different choices. And they're all good choices, I think.
Yes.
And they all make a stronger society. And so, the one thing I'd say is, we don't regret it. Yes, it boosted our economy. Yes, it got, some of the brightest and sharpest minds back into our workforce and in our workforce, and will be in the future. And this has been a societal thing over some time. When you get that that massive shift in the workforce, and you've been able to increase female workforce participation as we did to record levels, and we actually had one of the biggest closures in the gender pay gap during our time in government. I mean, there was no real secret to that. It's just more women were working. The economy was doing better, so there were more jobs. We got unemployment down to record lows, and that meant more women. Women were the biggest beneficiaries of the improved economic performance because they could participate.
Right. Yes, I'm so interested too. You hear about how it's good for families, but I'm actually curious, and I don't know if you have any data on this. Did it strengthen families too to increase the childcare subsidies? And again, you said earlier that the biggest breakdown in families is financial. When you take that stressor out of it, did you notice that families were strengthened because of it? And like I said, I don't know if you have any data to back that up.
No, look, I'm not aware of any data that says that, but it's a bit like if you put locks on the door and someone doesn't break in, how do you measure that?
Mm-hmm.
Um, um,
Okay.
it's
Point taken. Point
so
taken.
I suspect it avoided a lot of family
Mm-hmm.
damage that would have occurred. I mean, families are complex social things. They break apart
Yes,
for
they
many
are.
different reasons. There are many other things going in our societies other than economic that are destroying families. And I know that's a very
Mm-hmm.
hot topic in the United States as well. And I have a lot of sympathy with
Right.
those views. So yes, economics is
Mm-hmm.
incredibly important, but there are other things as well. So if you care about families, I think you're right. You've got to care about the economics, just not the social policies around families, because that, and then you help families make good choices for them.
Right. You have navigated a lot in your political career, and you actually had one of the top global economies during the pandemic. And so much of it is related to the work that you did to strengthen families. What would you tell employers about why childcare subsidies and supporting families, why that is good for not just the workforce, but it's good for their specific economy? I know that productivity goes up.
Yeah.
You see less absenteeism, but specifically, what are some of the benefits that the employer sees?
Yeah, you keep good people. And keeping good people in your business today is, I think, one of the biggest challenges for any business, anywhere, small or large. It's a global market for talent. To enable people to have choices through their life and to be able to remain engaged with you as an employer and inspired and appreciated and valued. This is all part and parcel of that. Now, that does require, large monolithic organisations it takes them a while to, change the course of the ship about how they manage these things. One of the things I have noticed, though, that I'd add a word of caution over is you've got to be very flexible, because everyone's family is different. Every person who's trying to remain engaged to the workforce is going to be different. And so I'm noticing, whether it's here or elsewhere, tightening of labour laws may sound all terribly, compassionate and helpful, but in many cases it ties employers' hands behind their back and stops them from being more flexible. I think we've moved from a very rigid sort of workplace relations environment, and we've moved into a much more demanded, flexible one. So what I'm trying to get at is that there has been a move to try and tighten labour laws, whether here in Australia or otherwise. And I have no doubt that they're positively motivated to protect workers, and that's true. But understand, at the end of the day, the employer's got to run a business, and if they can actually tailor how the hours, the times,
right,
the working conditions, where people work at home, where people work at the office, rather than trying to make it a one-size-fits-all set of entitlements that everybody must have. Well, some people don't need that much flexibility, frankly. But others do, and so having a flexible workplace environment, I think, is what is demanded in the modern economy today. And for some jobs, it's pretty straightforward. I mean, if you're a police officer, you still got to go. You've got to be out there on the beat and doing that job, and someone has to be out there. You can't do that from your living room. But at the same time, I should say what we found, and this is still a problem we have not been able to solve, is childcare arrangements for those who work in essential occupations. So nurses, police officers, people working in the fire services, things like that. They're working at 2:00 in the morning. It's pretty hard to get childcare.
Yeah, the third shift. It is, yeah.
And we trialled a few programs with sort of overnight nanny programs and things like that. I think there's still a lot more work to be done there, and you've got to try some stuff. And some of it's going to fail. Some of the things we tried failed, but the intent was good, because that is a real problem. I mean, particularly in the nursing profession, which is still dominantly female. Families will share the workload, and these days, like they didn't before, and that's good and fine. But we still can't pretend we've arrived at utopia and it all works that way. And the stress will always fall harder on women than it will on men.
I appreciate the ongoing effort, though. And again, those are essential workers. I worked third shift when I first moved to New York City and worked at ABC News. I worked the overnight news. So I would go to work at 9 p.m. and, come home around 9 a.m. I had a husband, though, who was sleeping and with the kids. So he was the nanny. He's the dad, as he should be taking care of the kids. But so I mentioned earlier, and then we'll wind this down, Prime Minister, but this whole conversation started really because of that message from Michael on LinkedIn, who is with an Australian childcare provider. And he told me that he was shocked to hear that there was little to no subsidized childcare or really any policies to support families. And I mentioned earlier too, we don't have subsidized childcare. We barely have child tax credits. We don't have universal pre-K. We really don't do a lot in the terms of subsidizing after school care. And we don't have federally funded paid family leave program. Are you surprised that we call ourselves a family-friendly country, and yet we're not really doing a whole lot in terms of policies and putting our money where our mouth is? Are you surprised?
Well, I knew, so I can't be surprised if I knew. It's the same with the way healthcare works. I mean, many of the debates you have in America, we don't have in Australia. They're sort of settled issues for a long time ago. And all I can say from that is that that's worked out very well for us. It's, it doesn't turn you into a socialist country. I'm a very conservative politician, and we were running childcare programs. Family tax benefit was introduced by, a conservative, more Republican type government here in Australia. So I am surprised. I get it, because America is a very different political society to Australia's. It just has a different origins. And I think that's a big challenge for the US to come at a lot of these issues that for, say, us, it's a bit of a no-brainer. Like, it's obvious, and we do it and always have, and we know the benefits of it, and we've experienced the benefits of them. But Michael's comment's interesting, because in Australia, I think sometimes, we take a bit for granted what we've got as well. I mean, the childcare system, even today, is heavily criticised in Australia, and was when I was in government as well. If people knew I was talking about childcare in your program, they go, well, why does he get to talk about that? We did a lot in childcare.
You can't do it. You can't win for losing, can you?
Exactly. So, I think in Australia, sometimes we do underappreciate the strong supports that we actually have here. And they are valued, and they are bipartisan. And I think that's something to aspire to. The other thing Michael would know, though, is quality childcare is also a challenge, and that's a workforce challenge. One of the big challenges here has been what childcare workers are paid, and the new government has done something about that. It's come at a very big cost, and potentially affordable childcare has to be affordable for those who are paying for it in the community, but it also has to be affordable for the government. Otherwise, they can't do it.
Yep.
So, you've got to get that balance right as well. And wherever you draw that line, people are going to be unhappy one way or the other. But the quality of the childcare, I'll finish on this, but preschool education, there's plenty of data to support this. But that is probably, take our Indigenous population in Australia, which is incredibly disadvantaged in terms of the outcomes they have in life. But one of the things that we found had the biggest impact on child development in the Indigenous population was preschool education. And we actually pursued that as what we call a Closing the Gap initiative when I was in government, and put more money into childcare, targeted, bespoke, into Indigenous communities. Because the results were there to show it, their development, how better they did it then at what we call primary school and then into secondary school, could be traced back to the early childhood education they get. And so in Australia, we actually combine the childcare support with the early childhood education in those latter years before going into what we call kindergarten and primary school. And I'd underline the need for that as well. Childcare doesn't just have to be child minding. Some of the kids do all day. Childcare is actually an opportunity to enrich your child.
To educate your kid. Yes.
If you happen to be in a situation where you choose to and wish to stay home with your child during the day, there's education going on there too. And so you want your child to be getting education and development, not just someone to make sure they're not walking in, onto a road or something like that, or they're getting fed. And that requires people with skills and who are trained to do that. So, yeah.
hmm And I appreciate that caveat and the transparency that, look, even though, I'm sitting here from my office in South Carolina saying, man, Australia's got it right. And you're like, but everyone here in Australia says we can do better. And you
Yeah.
mentioned the early childhood systems and how it's seen as education, not just child minding. Europe does a really nice job of this too,
Yeah,
where
that's true.
they have this mantra, I am my brother's keeper. And they believe in this next generation that children are the future and they are our greatest natural resource. So they are really investing in them. And that's what I'd really love to do here in America. And like you said, it strengthens families. So as we close, you were the 30th Prime Minister in Australia's history from 2018 to 2020. And you navigated, yes, the number one economy through the pandemic, but you saw wildfires and a recession and drought. And you're a man of deep faith as well. You wrote a book called Plans for Your Good, a Prime Minister's Testimony of God's Faithfulness. How did your personal faith really help navigate you through some of those like really, really trying political times? And how also did it inform your decision to want to support these family-friendly policies?
I can't name you another sort of sacred text other than the Bible that I think more places value on the family. And I think that's always been a core element of living a life of faith in Jesus Christ. But, I could extend that to other religions as well. Faith actually leads you to value the family, or it certainly should.
Yes, it does.
It certainly should. And the role that family has within society. And so, for me, faith was always a motivator to want to serve in politics. You're not going to go to the pages of Amos and find, thou shalt introduce a childcare policy with subsidized childcare and universal access to early childhood education. I mean, it's not a policy textbook in that sense, but it does tell you what's important. And for me, it informed my values. It informed what my purpose was in being in politics and what you tried to achieve. Now, politics is the debate really between the different ways of achieving that. And it always does grieve me that partisanship can be blind when it comes to appreciating that people of different political persuasions and still be motivated by the same faith. And so the politicization of people's faith, it always made me uncomfortable. And people sometimes would say, well, I'm a Christian and I don't agree with what you're doing on this policy. And I said, well, you have every right to disagree with my policy, but you don't get to judge my faith. The faith is the reason why I believe I'm doing this. You might disagree that it's the better way to do it, and we can have that debate and that discussion. And I always tried to do that in politics. I didn't debate my faith. I debated my policies. People, I hope, understood that why I was trying to do things was motivated by that. I wasn't a Pope of Australia. I was a Prime Minister of Australia, and faith informed my judgments, and it strengthened me in those times of great crisis. I spent a lot of my time as Prime Minister between 2018 and 22 on my knees in prayer, praying for my country, praying for the world on occasions. We dealt with the massive security challenges in our part of the world with the Chinese aggression and assertion, and that took a lot from us to stand up to them. And I looked to God to give me the strength to do that.
Well, I know you left politics earlier in 2024. What are you doing now? I know obviously you're staying busy, but where can people find you? Are you an activist? Are you just trying to enjoy your family? What does 2024 find you doing, Prime Minister?
Well, you're right. I left the Parliament early this year, but now I'm in the private sector. I'm advising companies around the world on what they're doing, and teamed up with some of those in the United States as well, and in defence and infrastructure, in the space sector as well, which I established the National Space Agency in Australia. So I'm getting to focus my attention on some of those things that I was particularly excited about when I was in government, and enjoyed that. But more importantly, I'm a dad and going to my local church and trying to be more relevant and active there, because, a life in politics removes you from a lot of those things. And so we've had some wonderful times as a family over the last couple of years, which were denied to my kids and Jen when they were growing up. So it's a special time. But I stay out of the media a fair bit these days.
How old are your girls?
15 and 17. So
okay, I have a 17-year-old and a 15-year-old and a 10-year-old as well. So, but I just want to say thank you so much for your service and this new direction that you're going in, and for being such an advocate for families. It's really, really just inspiring. So I wish that you could advise some American politicians too. And I wish you could also talk to us here in America to stop politicizing and putting a faith label on either party. Like you don't have to be one or the other. So I'm really encouraged. I'm really encouraged by you, Prime Minister.
Oh, good on
ScoMo,
you. Well,
I should say. I feel like we're on
happy to join you, and I wish you well with your advocacy. And I love our American friends, but we don't get everything right, and you guys don't get everything right. But I think one of the great things about Australia and the United States is we support each other and we learn from each other as well.
That's right. And as Mother Teresa said, if we really want to change the world, let's go home and love our families. And that's what we're doing right now. So I appreciate it. Okay. God bless. Thank you, Prime Minister. I hope you enjoyed that conversation. And a big thanks to Michael, who reached out to me on LinkedIn. I don't know if I set it up enough in the conversation with all of you, but Michael, who is with a childcare provider in Australia, reached out to me on LinkedIn. I'm very active on LinkedIn at Paula Ferris if you want to follow me. But that's where I do a lot of activism, and I talk about supporting families and working moms. And he reached out and he was just aghast that we didn't have subsidized childcare. And he's like, I don't get it. It's so good for the economy. So Michael, thank you for kind of giving me the nudge to have this conversation. And in terms of my takeaways from this conversation, I think what the Prime Minister said about options is so key to depoliticize this. You never want to force this on a family. Give them the option. We should have an option here in this country. If we want to, we can take advantage of these family-friendly policies. And if we don't, that's our choice. You have to give us choice and you have to give us options. But again, it's an economic issue. And there is so much stress and strain on families to have kids here in America. That financial stress can just wreck families. So if we can support families through family-friendly policies, it's the right thing to do. It strengthens families and it bolsters our economy, not to mention what it does for that gender equity gap, because it disproportionately affects women. Let's just be honest. The childcare alone, the lack of access to it is the number one reason why women aren't in the workforce like they want to be. And because there's so much stress on families, we're having fewer and fewer kids. In fact, we have record low birth rates. So what I want to do next week is invite probably one of the smartest people I've ever talked to the conversation. She's a sociologist. She is the executive director for the Council of Contemporary Families, Dr. Jennifer Glass. I interviewed her a lot for my book, You Don't Have to Carry It All. And she's going to talk about the record low birth rates, why this is happening, should we be concerned about it, and what we can do about it. But it's a really fascinating conversation. I can't wait for you to hear that. That's coming up next week as we continue to talk about it. Make sure you're signed up to get my personal newsletter at paulaferrisofficial.com. We will keep this conversation going. And I'm going to be posting a poll this week. I want you to weigh in. Do you think we're doing a good job supporting families in this country? All right. I want to hear from you. And we are going to keep talking about it. And I'm going to keep being fired up about this topic, y'all. I'll talk to you next week. I know you guys thought you were done with me, but not quite yet. I have one more thing to tell you about. If you're watching on YouTube or you're listening on your favorite podcast platform, don't forget to subscribe to the show. I don't want you to miss a single beat or a single conversation. And remember, my DMs are always open. Tell me what you want to talk about.